They say every man dreams of marrying someone who completes him, someone who makes the struggle worth it. But what happens when the person sleeping beside you every night, the one you trusted with your heart, your name, your legacy, turns out to be the architect of your destruction? What happens when love becomes a weapon, and your home becomes a battlefield? By the time the sun rose on March 15, 2023, the name Silas Wynn was everywhere. Headlines screamed his story across every news outlet in America. But the truth behind what happened that night, the real story of how a billionaire's empire crumbled in less than 24 hours, that's what we're about to uncover. And I promise you, by the end of this, you'll question everything you thought you knew about trust, family, and the price of success. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. His name was Silas Wynn, a man the world called untouchable. Billionaire, philanthropist, husband, son. But beneath the polished glass towers and charity galas, something dark was festering inside his home. A grand mansion in Charlotte, North Carolina. The sound of boiling water echoing through marble hallways. A scream that would shatter everything. Why did his wife attack his mother? What secret had been buried for 30 years that finally exploded that night? And what did Silas discover about the woman he married, about the father he thought abandoned him, that would make him question everything he'd ever believed about love, loyalty, and revenge? The wedding photos showed a perfect couple. The charity events displayed a united front. But behind every smile, every toast, every public appearance, a plan was unfolding. A plan that started long before Silas ever met the woman who would become his wife. A plan rooted in pain so deep, it turned love into a weapon and marriage into a battlefield. By the time you hear the whole story, you'll understand why some secrets should never be kept, and why some wounds never truly heal. Silas Wynn wasn't born into wealth. He didn't inherit millions or grow up in penthouses overlooking Central Park. No, Silas grew up in a small town outside Charleston, South Carolina, where the smell of pine trees mixed with the salt from the nearby coast, and where everyone knew everyone's business. His mother, Grace Wynn, raised him alone after his father, Thomas, vanished without a trace when Silas was just 7 years old. One morning Thomas kissed his son goodbye, said he was heading to work at the textile factory, and never came home. No body was ever found. No note was left behind. Just silence and questions that would haunt their family for decades. Grace worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. She cleaned houses during the day, worked the night shift at a local diner, and on weekends, she took in sewing work from neighbors. Her hands were always rough, always moving, always providing. Silas watched her sacrifice everything, watched her age faster than she should have, watched her smile even when he knew she was exhausted beyond measure. He made a promise to himself at 12 years old, sitting on their worn-out porch, that one day he would make enough money so his mother would never have to work again. And he kept that promise. By the time Silas turned 35, he had built Wynn Real Estate Group from absolutely nothing. He started by flipping abandoned houses in rough neighborhoods, using every cent he could scrape together and loans he could barely afford. He worked 18-hour days, slept in half-renovated properties, and ate ramen noodles for dinner more times than he could count. But he had vision. He saw potential where others saw decay. Within 10 years, he owned commercial properties in 6 states. Within 15 years, his company was valued at over $2 billion. Forbes featured him. Business schools studied his strategies. And Grace, his mother, finally retired at 62, moving into a beautiful cottage Silas bought for her just 20 minutes from his newly built estate. Everything Silas touched seemed to turn to gold. But success has a way of attracting people, and not all of them have good intentions. He met Naomi Vale at a charity gala in Manhattan in the spring of 2018. She was standing near the champagne fountain, wearing a midnight blue dress that caught the light just right. Her dark hair swept elegantly over one shoulder. She was laughing at something a colleague said, and when Silas walked past, she turned and their eyes met for just a moment. That moment changed everything. Naomi introduced herself as a consultant for nonprofit organizations, someone who helped charities maximize their fundraising efforts and community outreach. She was educated, articulate, passionate about helping others, or so it seemed. She spoke about growing up in Boston, about her parents who were both educators, about her love for literature and classical music. She was everything Silas thought he wanted. Sophisticated, independent, beautiful. They started dating within weeks, and within 6 months, Silas was convinced he'd found his missing piece. Grace met Naomi exactly twice before the wedding. The first time was at a small dinner Silas hosted at his estate. Naomi smiled warmly, complimented Grace's dress, asked polite questions about her life in Charleston. But Grace noticed something, a flicker of impatience when Grace spoke too long, a tightness around Naomi's eyes when Silas mentioned how much his mother meant to him. Grace said nothing that night. The second meeting was at the engagement party, a lavish event with 200 guests, live music, and enough flowers to fill a botanical garden. Grace stood quietly in the corner, watching Naomi glide through the crowd like she owned the room. When Silas brought Naomi over to take a photo with Grace, Naomi's smile was perfect, but her hand on Grace's shoulder felt cold, distant. Grace hugged her son that night and whispered, "Just be sure, baby. Be very sure." Silas laughed it off. He thought his mother was just being overprotective, unable to let go. He didn't realize she was trying to warn him. The wedding took place in June 2019 at a historic estate in the Hamptons. 300 guests. A string quartet. Roses imported from Ecuador. Naomi walked down the aisle like a vision, and when Silas saw her, tears filled his eyes. He thought he was the luckiest man alive. Grace sat in the front row, wearing a pale yellow dress Silas had bought for her, and she clapped when they kissed. But if you looked closely at the wedding photos later, really looked, you'd see Grace's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. You'd see her hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles pale. You'd see a mother who loved her son too much to ruin his happiness, even when every instinct told her something was wrong. By the end of that beautiful ceremony, with champagne flowing and guests dancing under string lights, no one suspected that the bride had just taken the first step in a carefully orchestrated plan that had been years in the making. A plan that had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with revenge. For the first year of marriage, everything seemed fine. Silas and Naomi lived in his estate just outside Charlotte, North Carolina, a sprawling property with 12 bedrooms, a pool, manicured gardens, and enough space that 2 people could go days without crossing paths. Naomi redecorated, hired a new staff, and hosted dinner parties for Silas's business associates. She played the role of the devoted wife beautifully. But behind closed doors, small cracks began to show. Naomi grew irritated when Silas spent too much time on the phone with Grace. She made subtle comments about how Grace's cottage was quaint, but maybe a bit beneath what Silas could afford. She suggested, more than once, that Grace might be happier in a senior living community where she'd have more social interaction. Silas dismissed it as concern, as Naomi trying to be helpful. He didn't see the calculation behind her words. In November 2020, Grace had a fall. She was walking down the steps of her cottage, carrying a basket of laundry, when she missed the last step and tumbled onto the brick pathway. A neighbor found her 20 minutes later, conscious but in pain, her wrist broken and her hip badly bruised. Silas got the call while he was in a board meeting. He left immediately, drove 90 miles per hour to the hospital, and didn't leave her side until the doctors assured him she would recover. But recovery would take time. Grace couldn't live alone, not for a while. The doctors recommended at least 8 weeks of supervision, someone to help her with daily tasks, physical therapy, medication schedules. Silas didn't hesitate. "Mom's moving in with us," he told Naomi that night. Naomi's face froze for just a second, a micro-expression of pure frustration, before she rearranged it into a smile. "Of course," she said softly. "Whatever your mother needs." Grace moved into the east wing of the estate 3 days later. Silas set her up in a spacious guest suite with a view of the gardens, brought her favorite books, made sure the staff knew to check on her regularly. For the first week, Naomi was polite, even kind. She brought Grace tea in the mornings, asked about her physical therapy sessions, smiled when Silas was in the room. But the moment Silas left for work, something shifted. The staff noticed it first. Naomi's tone would change when she spoke to Grace, clipped and cold. She'd walk past Grace's room without acknowledging her. She stopped joining them for family dinners, claiming she had headaches or work to do. And then the small cruelties began. Grace's favorite teacup disappeared. The thermostat in her room was turned down so low she woke up shivering. Her mail went missing. When Grace mentioned these things to Silas, he looked concerned but assured her it was probably just miscommunication with the new staff. One afternoon in early December, Grace was sitting in the sunroom, reading her Bible like she did every morning. Naomi walked in, saw her, and made a comment that cut deep. "Still praying to fix the past, Grace?" Naomi's voice was light, almost amused. Grace looked up, confused. "I pray for everyone, including you, dear." Naomi's smile was thin. "How noble. But maybe if prayer worked, your husband wouldn't have abandoned you 30 years ago." The words hung in the air like poison. Grace's hands trembled, but she said nothing. Naomi turned and walked away, leaving Grace sitting there with tears streaming down her face. When Silas came home that evening, Grace didn't tell him. She didn't want to cause problems. She didn't want to be the difficult mother-in-law. But the weight of Naomi's words pressed on her chest like a stone. By January 2021, the tension in the house was suffocating. Silas was too consumed with a massive commercial development deal in Atlanta to notice. He was traveling constantly, on conference calls at all hours, distracted and exhausted. Naomi seemed fine when he was around, affectionate even, but the moment he left, her mask slipped. The staff whispered among themselves. The head housekeeper, a woman named Carla who had worked for Silas for 8 years, noticed everything. She saw Naomi's cold stares. She heard the cutting remarks. One evening, Carla found Grace crying quietly in the kitchen, and Grace finally admitted, "I don't think she wants me here." Carla held Grace's hand and said gently, "Mrs. Wynn, you need to tell Silas." But Grace shook her head. "He's so happy with her. I can't ruin that." What Grace didn't know was that Carla had already started documenting everything, keeping notes, just in case. The mansion that once felt like a symbol of Silas's success had become a prison for Grace, and the walls were closing in. Then came the night of January 28, 2021. Silas was supposed to be in Atlanta for 3 days, closing the biggest deal of his career, a $400 million mixed-use development that would cement Wynn Real Estate as a national powerhouse. But the deal closed early, and Silas decided to surprise Naomi by coming home a day ahead of schedule. He texted her that he was on his way, but she didn't respond. He figured she was asleep. It was almost midnight when his car pulled into the driveway. The house was dark except for a single light glowing from the kitchen. Silas walked through the front door, loosening his tie, and heard the faint sound of water boiling. He thought maybe Naomi or Grace couldn't sleep and was making tea. But then he heard something else. Voices. Naomi's voice, sharp and venomous. And his mother's voice, calm but strained. Silas walked toward the kitchen, his footsteps silent on the marble floors. He could hear Naomi now, speaking louder. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? So pure. But you're just a pathetic old woman clinging to a son who's outgrown you." Silas froze just outside the kitchen door. His mother's voice was steady but pained. "Naomi, I don't know what I've done to make you hate me, but I've tried to be kind. I've tried to stay out of your way." Naomi laughed, cold and bitter. "Stay out of my way. You are in my way. You've been in my way since the moment I met Silas. Do you know how hard it is to build a life with someone when his mother is always there, always hovering, always reminding him of his sad little past?" Grace's voice broke slightly. "I just love my son." "Well, your love is suffocating," Naomi snapped. And then Silas heard a sound that made his blood run cold. The clatter of something metal. A gasp. And his mother's scream. He burst through the kitchen door and saw it. Grace was on the floor, clutching her arm, her skin red and blistering. A large pot lay overturned on the ground, steam still rising from the boiling water that had spilled across the tile. Naomi stood frozen, her hand still extended, her face pale. For a moment, no one moved. Then Silas was on his knees beside his mother, his hands shaking as he tried to assess the burns. Mom, look at me. Are you okay?" Grace was breathing hard, tears streaming down her face, but she nodded. Silas looked up at Naomi, his voice deadly calm. "What did you do?" Naomi's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Silas stood slowly, his body vibrating with rage he'd never felt before. "I asked you a question." Naomi finally found her voice, shaky and desperate. "It was an accident, Silas. I swear I didn't mean—" "She's burned, Naomi. My mother is burned. How is that an accident?" Naomi's eyes darted around the room, searching for an explanation, anything that would make sense. "She startled me. I was holding the pot, and she came up behind me and—" "That's a lie," Grace said quietly from the floor, her voice hoarse. Silas looked at her, and Grace met his eyes. "She threw it." The room went silent. Silas felt like the ground was crumbling beneath him. He pulled out his phone and called 911. Then he called his head of security. Within 15 minutes, the estate was flooded with paramedics, police officers, and staff members who had been woken by the commotion. Grace was taken to the hospital with second-degree burns on her arm and shoulder. Naomi was questioned by police in the living room, her story changing with every retelling. Silas stood in the hallway, staring at nothing, trying to process what had just happened. By morning, the story had leaked. One of the paramedics mentioned it to a friend. The friend mentioned it to a reporter. By noon, every major news outlet in the country was running the story. Billionaire's wife accused of assaulting mother-in-law. Silas's phone was ringing non-stop, his legal team, his PR team, business partners, reporters. He ignored all of it and went to the hospital. Grace was sleeping when he arrived, her arm wrapped in thick bandages, her face pale against the white pillows. Silas sat beside her bed and held her uninjured hand. When she woke up, she looked at him with so much sadness that it broke him. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Silas shook his head, his throat tight. "You have nothing to be sorry for, Mom. Nothing." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "I should have told you sooner. I should have said something about how she treated me. But I didn't want you to have to choose. There's no choice, Mom. There never was." Grace squeezed his hand weakly. "Don't let anger make your decisions, baby. Find out why first. Find out the truth." For the first time in his life, Silas Wynn, the man who controlled billion-dollar deals and commanded boardrooms, felt completely powerless. The media storm intensified. Reporters camped outside the hospital. His business partners started calling emergency meetings. Investors were nervous. The brand he'd spent decades building was being torn apart in real time. His lawyers were blunt. "Divorce her quietly. Settle this before it destroys everything you've worked for." But Silas couldn't think about business. He couldn't think about his reputation. All he could see was his mother lying in that hospital bed, burns covering her arm, and the look of betrayal in her eyes when she realized the woman Silas had brought into their lives had tried to hurt her. He thought about all the warning signs he'd missed. The cold glances. The subtle comments. The way Naomi's smile never quite reached her eyes when Grace was around. He'd been so consumed with building his empire, so focused on proving he could rise above his humble beginnings, that he'd ignored the one person who'd always been there for him. 3 days after the incident, while Grace was still recovering and Naomi sat in a holding cell awaiting bail, Silas made a decision. He needed answers. Not the surface-level explanations Naomi had given the police, but the real truth. Why would a woman who seemingly had everything, wealth, status, a husband who adored her, do something so cruel? It didn't make sense. Naomi wasn't unstable. She wasn't impulsive. Every move she'd made during their relationship had been calculated, deliberate. And that's what bothered Silas most. This wasn't a moment of rage. This felt planned. He contacted Diane Porter, a private investigator who'd helped him vet business partners in the past. "I need you to find out everything about my wife," he told her. "And I mean everything. Her childhood, her family, her education, every detail of her life before we met." Diane was thorough. Within a week, she called Silas into her office. The look on her face told him everything he needed to know. Whatever she'd found, it was bad. Diane laid out a folder on her desk, thick with documents, photographs, and records. "Silas, I'm going to be direct with you. The woman you married doesn't exist." Silas stared at her, confused. "What does that mean?" Diane opened the folder. Naomi Vale, the consultant, the woman with educator parents from Boston, the charity work. All of it is fabricated. Her real name is Naomi Russo. The name meant nothing to Silas. Diane continued. Her father was Vincent Russo. He worked at Hartwell Textiles in the early 90s. And then it clicked. Silas felt his stomach drop. Hartwell Textiles. That's where my father worked. Diane nodded slowly. In 1993, the company went bankrupt after a financial scandal. Several executives were investigated for embezzlement. Vincent Russo was convicted and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. He died in 2015, 2 years after his release. Silas's mind was racing. What does this have to do with my father? Diane pulled out another document, old court records, witness testimonies, financial statements. "According to the evidence I found, Vincent Russo didn't commit the crime he was convicted of. He was framed. And the man who framed him was Thomas Wynn." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. His father. The man who'd abandoned them. The man Silas had spent years trying to understand, trying to forgive. He wasn't just a coward who ran away from his family. He was a criminal who destroyed another family to save himself. Diane's voice was gentle but firm. Thomas falsified documents, manipulated financial records, and made Vincent the scapegoat. When the investigation started getting close to the truth, Thomas disappeared. He left before anyone could connect the dots back to him. Silas felt sick. And Naomi? Diane pulled out more documents. Photos of a young girl visiting a man in prison. School records under the name Naomi Russo. Articles about Vincent's trial. She grew up visiting her father behind bars. She watched her family fall apart. Her mother worked multiple jobs just to survive. Their name became synonymous with shame and disgrace. And when Vincent died, still maintaining his innocence, something in Naomi changed. Diane showed Silas printouts of internet searches, forum posts, public records requests, all under various pseudonyms but traceable back to Naomi. She'd spent years researching the Hartwell Textile scandal, piecing together evidence that her father was innocent, tracking down everyone involved. And then she'd found Silas, the son of Thomas Wynn, the billionaire, the success story. She created an entirely new identity, Diane explained. Erased her past, manufactured a background specifically designed to appeal to you, and inserted herself into your world. This wasn't chance, Silas. Meeting you at that gala wasn't coincidence. She engineered it. Silas sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. Everything he thought he knew about his life was a lie. His father was a criminal. His wife was a stranger. And his mother, the one person who'd always been honest with him, had suffered because he'd been too blind to see the truth. But the truth went even deeper. Over the next week, as Diane continued her investigation, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Naomi hadn't just married Silas for revenge. She'd been systematically dismantling his life for 2 years. The investigator uncovered offshore accounts where money had been siphoned from Silas's company, small amounts at first, then larger transfers disguised as charitable donations or business expenses. She found emails between Naomi and competitors, sharing confidential information about Wynn Real Estate's upcoming projects, sabotaging deals before they could close. She found evidence that Naomi had been feeding negative stories about Silas to the press, planting seeds of doubt about his business practices, his integrity. Every setback Silas had faced over the past 2 years, every deal that fell through at the last minute, every unexpected complication, it all traced back to Naomi. The night Grace confronted her wasn't random. Grace had discovered something. According to Carla, the housekeeper, Grace had found documents in Naomi's office, papers that Naomi thought she'd hidden well enough. Records about Hartwell Textiles. Photos of Vincent Russo. Research about Thomas Wynn. Grace had pieced it together. She'd realized who Naomi really was and what she was doing to her son. Grace confronted Naomi privately that night, asking her directly about her real identity. And Naomi, perhaps relieved to finally drop the mask, told her everything. She told Grace about her father's wrongful imprisonment, about watching him waste away in a cell, about the poverty and shame her family endured while Thomas Wynn's family struggled but at least remained free. She told Grace how she discovered that Thomas's son had become a billionaire, how it felt like a cosmic injustice that the child of a criminal was living in luxury while she, the daughter of an innocent man, had grown up with nothing. Grace listened to all of it. And then, instead of reacting with anger, Grace said something that cut Naomi deeper than any insult could have. "I understand your pain. I really do. But you've spent so much energy hating a man who isn't even here that you've become the very thing you despise. You've turned into someone who destroys innocent people to satisfy your own need for revenge. Just like Thomas did to your father." Those words shattered something in Naomi. Because Grace was right. In her quest for justice, Naomi had become exactly what she hated most. She'd lied, manipulated, hurt people who'd done nothing to her. She'd married a man under false pretenses, not because she loved him, but because she wanted to destroy him. And worst of all, she was about to hurt an innocent woman, the same way Thomas had hurt her innocent father. But instead of stopping, instead of recognizing what Grace was trying to show her, Naomi's rage took over. She grabbed the pot of boiling water off the stove, and in a moment of pure, uncontrolled fury, she threw it. When Silas learned all of this, sitting in Diane's office surrounded by documents that detailed his wife's betrayal, he felt something break inside him. Not just his heart, but his entire understanding of reality. The woman he'd loved didn't exist. The father he'd mourned was a monster. The life he'd built was constructed on lies. He thought about Grace, about how she'd tried to protect him even after discovering the truth. About how she'd asked him not to let anger guide his decisions, to find out why first. She'd known that if Silas understood Naomi's pain, he might be able to forgive. And Grace was right to worry, because in that moment, Silas wanted to make Naomi pay for everything. He wanted to use every resource, every connection, every ounce of power he had to destroy her the way she tried to destroy him. But then he heard his mother's voice in his head. Find out why first. He visited Naomi in jail on a cold February morning, 2 weeks after that terrible night. She was thinner, her face gaunt, her eyes hollow. She'd been denied bail after the prosecutor argued she was a flight risk, given that her entire identity was fabricated. When she saw Silas through the glass partition, she didn't cry or beg or try to manipulate him. She just stared, like she'd been waiting for this moment, like she'd always known it would come. Silas picked up the phone on his side and waited. Naomi picked up hers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy with everything unsaid, everything that could never be fixed. Then Silas said quietly, "I know about your father." Naomi's jaw tightened, but she didn't look away. "Good. Then you know why I did it." Silas nodded slowly. I know my father destroyed your family. I know you grew up in pain because of him. I know you lost your father to a prison cell while I grew up thinking mine just abandoned us." Naomi's eyes flickered with something, surprise maybe, or confusion. She hadn't expected him to acknowledge her pain. Silas continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know what it's like to hate someone you've never met. To spend years wondering why they left, why they chose themselves over you. I know what it's like to watch your mother work herself to exhaustion trying to fill the hole that person left behind." Naomi's throat worked as she swallowed hard. Silas leaned forward slightly. "But here's what I also know. You had everything, Naomi. You had me. You had a life, a future, a chance to build something real. And you chose to throw it all away for revenge against a man who's been gone for 30 years. You chose to hurt people who had nothing to do with what happened to your father." Naomi's voice was sharp when she finally spoke, defensive. "You don't understand what it's like to watch your father waste away in a cell for something he didn't do. You don't understand the rage that builds when you see the son of the man who destroyed your life living like a king while your family struggled to survive." Silas nodded. "You're right. I don't. But I understand what it's like to lose a father. I understand what it's like to watch your mother sacrifice everything just to keep you fed and clothed. And I understand that you didn't just hurt me, Naomi. You hurt an innocent woman who had absolutely nothing to do with any of this. My mother never wronged you. She never wronged your father. She was just another victim of Thomas Wynn's selfishness, just like you were." Naomi looked away, her jaw clenched tight. Silas could see tears forming in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "She was always in the way," Naomi said quietly, but there was less conviction in her voice now. "No," Silas said firmly. "She was never your enemy. My father was. But he's not here to face the consequences of what he did, so you decided to make me and my mother pay for his sins instead. You punished the wrong people, Naomi. And in doing that, you became exactly what you hated. You became the person who destroys innocent lives to serve your own agenda." The words hung in the air between them. Naomi's face crumpled slightly, and for the first time since he'd known her, Silas saw the real person underneath all the lies. Not the sophisticated consultant or the vengeful daughter, but a broken woman who'd let pain consume her until there was nothing left but rage and emptiness. Silas stood up slowly. "I hope you find peace someday, Naomi. I really do. But you're not going to find it by destroying other people. You're only destroying yourself." He hung up the phone and walked out of that jail, and he never looked back. Because he understood something his mother had tried to teach him his entire life. Holding on to hate only poisons you. It doesn't heal anything. It doesn't bring justice. It just makes you sick. The legal process took months. Naomi was charged with assault, fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft. The evidence was overwhelming. Her lawyers tried to negotiate, tried to paint her as a victim driven to desperation by her father's wrongful conviction, but the prosecution wasn't interested in sympathy. She'd committed serious crimes, hurt innocent people, and shown no remorse until she was caught. In the end, Naomi pled guilty to avoid a lengthy trial and was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Silas could have pushed for more. His lawyers told him they could make her life significantly worse if he wanted. But he didn't. He'd already spent too much energy on hate. He let the justice system handle it and focused on what mattered, rebuilding his life and taking care of his mother. Grace spent 3 weeks in the hospital. The burns on her arm and shoulder were serious, requiring skin grafts and intensive therapy. Silas never left her side except when absolutely necessary. He brought her favorite books, played her favorite music, held her hand through the painful treatments. And slowly, Grace began to heal. The physical scars would remain, faint marks on her skin that would never completely fade. But Grace said she didn't mind them. "They remind me," she told Silas one afternoon as they sat by the hospital window, "that I survived. That we both survived." Silas looked at his mother, This woman who'd endured so much, lost so much, and still found the strength to forgive. How do you do it, Mom? How do you not hate her for what she did? Grace was quiet for a moment, watching birds fly past the window. Then she said, "Because hate would only hurt me, baby. It wouldn't change what happened. It wouldn't undo the burns or erase the pain. It would just keep me trapped in that moment forever." She turned to look at him. "Naomi is in prison now. She's paying for what she did. But I refuse to build a prison in my own heart." Silas's company took a significant hit during the scandal. Several major investors pulled out, nervous about the negative publicity. Business partners distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with the chaos. Some deals fell through entirely. For a few months, it looked like everything Silas had built might actually crumble. But Silas was resilient. He'd started from nothing once before, and if he had to, he'd do it again. He restructured the company, brought in new partners who believed in his vision, and worked harder than he'd worked in years to rebuild trust. It took time, patience, and countless sleepless nights, but slowly, Wynn Real Estate stabilized. Within a year, the company was not only surviving but growing again. Not at the explosive pace it had before, but steadily, sustainably. And this time, Silas did things differently. He prioritized ethics over profits. He mentored young entrepreneurs instead of crushing competition. He built relationships based on mutual respect rather than ruthless ambition. He also made a much more personal change. He sold the estate in Charlotte, that massive property that held too many painful memories. He couldn't walk through those marble hallways without seeing his mother on the kitchen floor, couldn't sit in that dining room without remembering Naomi's cold stares. So he let it go. He bought a smaller home on the coast of South Carolina, just 30 minutes from where he'd grown up. It was modest by his standards, only 4 bedrooms, but it had a view of the ocean and enough space for Grace to live comfortably. Grace moved in with him as soon as she was released from the hospital. Silas converted the ground floor guest room into a suite for her, complete with everything she needed for her continued physical therapy. And for the first time in decades, Silas and Grace lived under the same roof again. Not because Grace needed constant care anymore, but because Silas realized he'd spent so many years chasing success that he'd missed out on simply being with the person who mattered most. On a quiet Sunday morning in March 2023, exactly 2 years after that terrible night, Silas and Grace sat on the porch of their new home, watching the sun rise over the ocean. The air was cool and salty, filled with the sound of waves crashing against the shore. Grace sipped her tea slowly, her hands steady now, the scars on her arm visible but no longer painful. Silas looked at his mother and asked the question that had been on his mind for months. "Do you ever regret not telling me sooner? About how Naomi treated you?" Grace thought about it for a moment, then shook her head. "No, baby. You had to learn this lesson in your own time. And honestly, I don't think you would have believed me if I'd told you before you saw it with your own eyes." Silas knew she was right. "Do you think she'll ever find peace?" Grace looked out at the water, her voice soft. "I hope so. For her sake, not ours. Carrying that much anger is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die." Silas smiled despite himself. "You're too wise for your own good, Mom." Grace patted his hand. "I've just lived long enough to know that holding on to bitterness only makes you sick. Forgiving Naomi didn't change what she did. It just freed me from carrying her burden." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the sound of waves filling the space between them. Silas thought about his father, about the choices Thomas made that rippled through so many lives. He thought about Naomi, about how she'd let her pain consume her until there was nothing left but rage. And he thought about himself, about how close he'd come to losing everything that mattered because he'd been too focused on building an empire to notice the cracks in his foundation. Later that afternoon, Silas did something he hadn't done in years. He went through old boxes in the attic, looking for photos of his father. He found one, faded and creased, of Thomas holding him as a baby, smiling at the camera like he didn't have a care in the world. Silas stared at that photo for a long time, trying to reconcile the man in the picture with the man who'd destroyed lives and disappeared. He felt anger, yes, but also something unexpected. Pity. His father had chosen greed and cowardice over family, and he'd spent the last 30 years running from the consequences, assuming he was even still alive. Silas thought about the life Thomas could have had if he'd just been honest, if he'd just faced his mistakes. But he didn't. And in the end, Thomas Wynn's legacy wasn't his son's success. It was the pain he left behind. Silas put the photo back in the box and closed it. He didn't need to carry that anymore. 3 months later, Silas was invited to speak at a business conference in New York. The organizers wanted him to share his story, the rise from poverty to billionaire status. Silas accepted, but he didn't tell the story they expected. He stood on that stage in front of 1,000 people and talked about failure. He talked about trust and betrayal. He talked about his mother and the sacrifices she made. He talked about Naomi and the pain that had driven her to destroy everything. And he talked about forgiveness, not as weakness, but as the hardest and bravest thing a person can do. When he finished, the room was silent. Then one person started clapping, then another, until the entire audience was on their feet. Silas didn't feel like a success story in that moment. He felt like a man who'd survived something most people never have to face. And that was enough. Grace passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 years later, in the spring of 2025. She was 72 years old. Silas found her in the morning, still holding her Bible, a soft smile on her face like she'd seen something beautiful just before she went. He sat beside her bed and cried harder than he'd cried in his entire life, not because he wasn't prepared to lose her, you're never really prepared, but because he was so grateful he'd had those final years with her. Years where it was just the two of them, no distractions, no chaos. Just a son and his mother, finally at peace. At her funeral, Silas stood at the podium and said, "My mother taught me that the measure of a person isn't how much money they make or how successful they become. It's how they treat people when there's nothing to gain from it. She forgave people who didn't deserve it. She loved people who couldn't love her back. And she never, not once, let bitterness steal her joy." He paused, his voice breaking. "I spent so many years trying to make her proud by building an empire. But the truth is, she was already proud of me, just for being her son. And that's the real fortune I inherited." Silas still runs Wynn Real Estate, but he does it differently now. He mentors young entrepreneurs from underserved communities, offering them the opportunities he once dreamed of. He funds scholarships for kids who lost parents to the prison system, kids like Naomi once was. And every year, on the anniversary of that terrible night, he visits a small community center in Boston that serves families affected by wrongful incarceration. He doesn't do it for publicity. He doesn't announce it. He just shows up, listens to their stories, and offers whatever help he can. Because he understands now that his father's sins don't have to define his legacy. He gets to choose what he leaves behind. And he chooses grace. He chooses forgiveness. He chooses to be the man his mother raised him to be. So here's my question for you. If you were in Silas's position, if you discovered that the person you loved most had married you as part of a revenge plot, could you forgive them? Could you walk away without needing to see them destroyed? And if you were Naomi, if you'd grown up watching your father suffer for someone else's crime, would you have been able to let go of that anger, or would you have done the same thing she did? These aren't easy questions, but they're important ones. Because the truth is, we all carry pain from our past. We've all been hurt by people we trusted. And we all have to decide every single day whether we're going to let that pain turn us into people we don't recognize, or whether we're going to choose something better. Something harder. Something that requires more courage than revenge ever will. Silas chose forgiveness. Grace chose peace. What would you choose? Don't forget to subscribe. See you on the next story.